Every Monday morning for 6 months, the same man walked into the flower shop, chose the same yellow gardenia, and left without a word. Cecily Moore believed she knew two men, the silent stranger in the dark greatcoat, and General Dorian Vale, cold, unyielding, the living symbol of the power that had destroyed her family's name. She never suspected they were the same person. He never knew she had kept the note he wrote, but never gave her. When the masks finally fall, what is revealed is neither a general nor a stranger, but a man who learned to hide so perfectly that he forgot how to be seen. And she, who survived by erasing her own name, is the only one who can find him. The air in Charleston, even at 7 bells on a Monday morning in May, already carried the thick, sweet weight of humidity. It clung to the white-painted iron gates along Meeting Street, glossed the broad leaves of the magnolias, and promised a day of relentless heat. Inside Bath's florist, however, a cool, shadowed tranquility reigned, scented by cut camellias and the sharp, clean tang of damp earth. Cecily Moore, her fingers deft amongst a tray of potted ranunculus, found a quiet order in the rhythm of the shop. Her movements were economical, each stem trimmed, each leaf polished with a practiced hand. Her dark hair, pulled back into a severe but elegant knot, caught the faint, diffused light from the street, hinting at auburn threads. She had been at Bath's for 2 years. Since the autumn, her father's name had been dragged through the federal reconstruction courts, a name once synonymous with integrity, now whispered with accusations of fraud and collusion. Cecily Moore, she called herself now, her mother's maiden name. It was simpler. It opened doors where the full weight of the Caldwell scandal would have slammed them shut. Her education, once a luxury, was now her most valuable tool. She managed the ledgers, orchestrated the intricate arrangements for the city's few remaining grand occasions, and cultivated the shop's reputation for understated elegance. She understood the language of flowers as she understood the language of contracts, precise, demanding, and often concealing more than it revealed. Every Monday, precisely between 8 and 8:15, he came. He was a tall man, his frame disciplined by habit. Even in the civilian greatcoat he always wore, a garment of dark, heavy wool that seemed incongruous with the burgeoning heat. It was early, the cobblestones still damp from the night's dew, but the coat was a statement, a barrier. He moved with a quiet authority that required no outward show. His eyes, the color of a winter sky over a bleak northern sea, recorded everything, yet betrayed nothing. He never glanced at the riot of color and scent that filled the shop, never lingered on the delicate blush of a sweet pea or the vibrant hue of a dahlia. His gaze went directly to Cecily, then to the single, specific bloom he always requested, a yellow gardenia. This morning, as on every Monday for the last 6 months, he entered with the same deliberate step, the bell above the door offering a brief, polite chime. The air shifted, carrying a faint scent of starched linen and something else, something clean and vaguely metallic, like gun oil overlaid with the faint, sweet perfume of the street. Cecily, who had been arranging a cluster of white jasmine for a funeral spray, paused. Her hands, usually so steady, did not tremble, but an inexplicable stillness settled over her. He approached the counter, his presence filling the small space without seeming to displace anything. He did not speak immediately. Instead, his gaze settled on the tray of yellow gardenias, their waxy petals unfolding in perfect, creamy symmetry. Cecily reached for the finest one. It sent a deep, almost narcotic sweetness that belied its innocent color. She wrapped the stem carefully in damp moss and brown paper, her movements precise, professional. He watched her, a stillness in his posture that suggested a man accustomed to long vigils. His eyes, though unreadable, held a depth that Cecily found herself observing despite her usual discipline. Most men, when confronted with a woman in her position, either overcompensated with false joviality or retreated into awkward silence. This man did neither. He simply existed, observing, waiting. When she presented the wrapped flower, he took it with a gloved hand. The exchange of coin was swift, efficient, yet this time a slight hesitation lingered. "A fine bloom," he offered, his voice a low, resonant baritone, the words measured, almost clipped, as if each one had been weighed before release. It was not a compliment, not truly, but an observation of fact. Cecily met his gaze. "It is," she affirmed, her own voice calm, devoid of the practiced deference most offered to men of his apparent standing. "They are at their peak this season." A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred at the corners of his mouth, a tightening that might have been the ghost of a smile, quickly suppressed. He held the gardenia, not by its stem, but cradled in his palm, as if it were something fragile and precious. "Indeed," he murmured, the single word carrying an unexpected warmth, a fleeting departure from his usual reticence. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and exited, the bell chiming his departure, leaving behind the lingering scent of gardenia and a faint, almost imperceptible trace of that metallic, clean aroma. Cecily watched him go, her gaze following the straight line of his back until he disappeared around the corner of the street. The air in the shop seemed to expand again, the quiet returning to its usual less charged hum. She resumed her work, trimming the jasmine, but her thoughts, usually so strictly confined to the practicalities of the shop, now drifted. He was an anomaly, a man of obvious power, yet he sought out the quietest corner of her world, not for grand displays, but for a single, unassuming flower. He never spoke of where it went, or for whom. And each week, a single word, a brief phrase, or that almost smile, seemed to break through his formidable reserve, a tiny crack in the meticulously constructed facade. Cecily, trained by years of managing a household and then a ledger, noticed these things. She catalogued them, not with sentiment, but with the precise detached curiosity of an archivist encountering a puzzling document. She did not know his name, she did not know his purpose, but she knew he would be back next Monday, and a small, unacknowledged part of her found herself waiting for it. Charleston society, even in its reduced circumstances, clung to its rituals with a desperate tenacity. Balls, though fewer and less opulent than before the war, still marked the season, providing a fragile illusion of continuity amidst the city's reconstruction. Tonight, the grand ballroom of the Rutledge House, still owned by a family whose fortunes had not entirely dissolved, was alight with gas lamps. The air, despite the open windows and the faint breeze from the harbor, was thick with the scent of magnolias and the cloying sweetness of jasmine, mingling with expensive perfumes and the faint, acrid tang of cigar smoke from the gentleman's lounge. Cecily Moore, attending with Mrs. Bath as a chaperone and a silent, indispensable assistant in managing the floral arrangements, moved through the periphery of the gathering. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, a color that made her eyes appear almost black in the dim light. It was a simple dress, carefully altered from one of her mother's, but its cut was elegant, its fabric of good quality. Her dark hair was once again secured in a neat chignon, a single yellow gardenia, plucked from the shop's fresh delivery that afternoon, tucked behind her ear. It was a small rebellion, a private gesture. Her role was to ensure the garlands remained fresh, the potted palms correctly placed, and to be unobtrusively invisible. This she managed with practiced ease, her gaze sweeping over the room, absorbing details with the same precision she applied to her ledgers. She saw the familiar faces of old Charleston, their pride etched into their unyielding expressions, their conversations often circling back to what had been lost. She saw the new faces, too, the northern businessmen, the federal officials, their confidence a stark contrast to the quiet desperation around them. Then she saw him, General Dorian Vale. He stood near the wide double doors, a sentinel in his dark blue federal uniform, the gold braid and polished brass buttons gleaming under the gaslight. His presence was a stark, unyielding fact in the room, a point around which all other activity seemed to pivot, even if subtly. He was taller than most, his shoulders broad, his posture rigidly military. His dark hair, meticulously parted, showed the first faint streaks of silver at the temples, catching the light. His eyes, the same piercing grey-blue she had observed across the counter, swept the room with an almost predatory efficiency. They recorded everything, missed nothing, yet revealed nothing in return. Cecily felt an immediate visceral response to him. It was not admiration nor fear, but a prickle of something akin to resentment. He embodied everything that had fractured her world, everything that had stripped her family of its name and standing. He was the federal authority, the unyielding power that now dictated the terms of her city's existence. She had heard the whispers about him, implacable, fair to a fault, but utterly without mercy for those who defied federal law. He was a man of cold, calculated precision, a general who ran a city like a campaign. Their paths had crossed once before, briefly, at a similar function a month ago. He had offered her a curt nod when introduced, his hand a brief, firm pressure, his gaze passing over her with the same detached assessment he might apply to a troop formation. He had not lingered. She had found his dismissive politeness infuriating. She was not a subordinate to be acknowledged, nor a socialite to be charmed. She was Cecily Moore, and she would not be dismissed. Tonight, as she moved past a cluster of ladies discussing the latest gossip, her path brought her closer to where he stood. He was engaged in conversation with Senator Thaddeus Thorne, a man whose name was synonymous with Northern Railroad interests and whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. Thorne, a portly man with a florid face and a booming laugh, was gesturing expansively, no doubt discussing some land grant or political maneuver. General Vale listened, his expression unreadable, his answers short, precise. As Cecily adjusted a drooping camellia in a nearby vase, she felt his gaze. It was not a casual glance, but a deliberate, almost analytical sweep. Her heart, usually so steady, gave a small, unbidden lurch. She did not meet his eyes directly, but she felt the weight of his attention, a palpable pressure in the air. It was the same intensity she'd felt across the counter, but here, in this public setting, it felt different, colder, more scrutinizing. He finished his conversation with Thorne, offering a brief, almost imperceptible nod to the senator. Then his eyes found hers. This time, their gazes locked for a beat longer than was strictly polite. There was no warmth, no recognition, only that same deep, observing intensity. She felt a shiver, not of fear, but of an unexpected, defiant challenge. She would not drop her eyes. She would not be cowed. Finally, he gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been imagined, and turned his attention to another group of dignitaries. The moment passed, leaving Cecily with a strange mix of relief and a lingering, unsettling awareness. He had seen her. He had acknowledged her presence, however briefly, and his gaze had felt like a judgment, a silent weighing of her worth. She moved away, her movements perhaps a fraction less smooth than before. The yellow gardenia behind her ear felt suddenly conspicuous, a small defiant splash of color against the elegant severity of her gown. She found herself wishing, almost irrationally, that he had not seen it, or that he had. She wasn't sure which. Later, as the ball began to wind down, Cecily overheard a snatch of conversation between two ladies near the punch bowl. "The general is a man of singular habits," one whispered, fanning herself languidly. "So proper, so precise, he never seems to unbend." "Indeed," the other replied. "They say he has no vices, no passions, just duty. A cold man, but effective, I suppose." Cecily listened, a strange sense of dissonance settling over her. A man of singular habits. Precise, cold, effective. It was a perfect description of the general, yet she remembered the almost smile, the unexpected warmth in his voice when he had admired the yellow gardenia that morning. The man in the greatcoat, the man who came to her shop. She dismissed the thought. It was illogical. Two different men, two different worlds. The general was a figure of authority, a symbol of the occupation. The man in the greatcoat was something else, a quiet, unassuming presence who brought a fleeting moment of unexpected warmth to her Monday mornings. The idea that they could be one and the same was absurd, yet the memory of those eyes, those impossibly deep, observing eyes, lingered. It was a thought she would not allow herself to fully entertain. Not yet. The week following the Rutledge House ball passed in a blur of activity for Cecily. Orders for spring arrangements piled up, the humid Charleston air demanding constant attention to the shop's fragile inventory. She immersed herself in the work, allowing the meticulous demands of her craft to quiet the unsettling echoes of General Vale's gaze. She told herself the fleeting connection she'd felt was merely a trick of the gaslight, a product of her own weariness. The two men were distinct, separate. One, a quiet, almost gentle presence in her shop. The other, an imposing, unyielding figure of federal power. But the memory of those eyes, those impossibly deep grey-blue eyes, persisted. Monday arrived, bringing with it the familiar sense of anticipation. The morning light filtered through the shop's window, painting the cut flowers in hues of gold and rose. The scent of sweet peas and jasmine filled the air, a familiar comfort. Cecily arranged a display of newly arrived ranunculus, her hands moving with their usual practiced grace. She wore a simple dark blue dress, a practical garment for the demands of the shop, her hair once again pulled back in its severe knot. Precisely at 8:10, the bell above the door chimed. He entered, his dark greatcoat a familiar silhouette against the bright morning. He moved with the same quiet authority, his gaze settling first on Cecily, then on the waiting tray of yellow gardenias. The air in the shop, already thick with the scent of blooms, seemed to thicken further, charged with an unspoken presence. Cecily felt her breath catch, a sudden sharp intake she quickly suppressed. She reached for the chosen gardenia, her fingers, despite her outward calm, experiencing a faint, unfamiliar tremor. She wrapped it in the usual damp moss and brown paper, her movements slower than usual, deliberately so. She needed time to observe, time to confirm. As she presented the flower, he took it, his gloved hand brushing hers for a fleeting second. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her. She forced herself to meet his gaze, searching for something, anything, that would distinguish this man from the general. His eyes, they were the same piercing, intelligent grey-blue, the same depth of observation, the same almost painful stillness. But here, in the quiet intimacy of the shop, they held a different quality, a subtle softening at the edges, a hint of something unburdened. It was not a smile, not exactly, but a quiet, almost imperceptible warmth that seemed to emanate from within. "The scent is particularly fine today," he remarked, his voice that low, resonant baritone, the words precise, but with that familiar, almost tender quality she had come to associate with him. He held the gardenia, cradling it, as if to inhale its delicate perfume. Cecily's mind raced, the voice, the posture, the eyes, the way he held the flower. It was all him, the General, Dorian Vale, the man who had treated her with detached politeness at the ball, the man whose reputation for implacable coldness preceded him, was standing before her, asking about the scent of a gardenia. She felt a strange mix of disbelief and a sudden, sharp clarity. How could she have been so blind? Or rather, how could he have maintained such a perfect dichotomy? "Indeed," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt, "the morning dew enhances it." He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible incline of his head. Then his gaze, which had been resting on the gardenia, lifted to hers. This time there was a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. A question, a recognition, a challenge. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, subsumed by that characteristic stillness. He paid, the familiar clink of coins on the counter echoing in the quiet shop. He turned to leave, but then he paused. His hand, still holding the gardenia, rested for a moment on the edge of the counter. "Miss Moore," he said, and the use of her name spoken in that low, precise tone felt like a revelation. He had known her name all along. "There is a resilience to this city, and to its people. It is noteworthy." The words hung in the air, a quiet observation, a statement of fact. But for Cecily they carried a hidden weight. Was he speaking of the city or of her? Was it a veiled compliment or a strategic assessment? She met his gaze, her own expression carefully neutral. "Survival demands it, General," she replied, the title slipping out before she could stop it. Her heart pounded. She had said it. The word was out. A flicker, faster this time, crossed his eyes, a tightening at the corners of his mouth. Was it surprise, recognition, or something else entirely? He said nothing. His gaze held hers for another long, silent beat. Then, with that curt nod she knew so well from the ball, he turned and exited the shop. The bell chimed, marking his departure. Cecily stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the cool wood of the counter. The scent of gardenias, once a comfort, now felt charged with a new, complex meaning. She had called him General. He had not flinched, not denied it. He had simply absorbed it, as he absorbed everything. The realization settled over her, chilling and exhilarating at once. The two men were indeed one. The quiet, observant customer who sought a single yellow gardenia every Monday, and the formidable, unyielding General Dorian Vale, the highest authority in Charleston. He had maintained this elaborate charade, this carefully constructed dual identity, for months, and she, in her own carefully constructed anonymity, had been drawn into it. Why? Why this elaborate ritual? Why the different demeanor, the different persona? He came to her, a woman whose family name was tainted, whose livelihood depended on discretion. He, the embodiment of the power that had brought her low, sought her out in this quiet, unassuming way. She understood with a sudden sharp insight that this was not merely a coincidence or a casual habit. It was deliberate, and she, with her own hidden identity, had stumbled upon his. He had allowed her to see it, perhaps even invited it. Cecily walked to the display of yellow gardenias, picking one up. She inhaled its sweet, heavy perfume. It was no longer just a flower. It was a symbol, a question, a challenge. She would not confront him directly. Not yet. She would observe. She would test. She would unravel the layers of this carefully constructed deception. The game had begun, and she, Cecily Moore, daughter of a ruined man, was now a player. She needed to be certain, and certainty, she knew, was a precise and demanding thing. The revelation that General Dorian Vale and the quiet man of the greatcoat were one and the same settled into Cecily's mind, not as a shock, but as a complex equation finally solved. It lent a new, almost dizzying clarity to past interactions, reframing every glance, every clipped word, every almost smile. The initial anger born of his deception quickly gave way to a cold, analytical curiosity. Why the masquerade? What did he seek in the quiet anonymity of Bath's florist that the formidable General Vale could not find in the halls of power? Her own position was delicate. She had called him General in the shop. He had not acknowledged it with words, but his stillness had been a profound affirmation. He knew she knew. And now the game would shift. The next Monday morning, the air was heavy with the promise of a summer storm, the sky a bruised purple over the rooftops of Charleston. Inside Bath's, the air was still, thick with the scent of rain and damp earth. Cecily, preparing a large order of white lilies, felt a familiar tension tighten her shoulders. Today she would begin her test. He arrived at his usual time, his greatcoat still incongruous against the oppressive heat, but somehow, on him, it simply appeared as an extension of his formidable presence. He moved to the counter, his eyes, those deep, observing grey-blue eyes, meeting hers. There was no flicker of acknowledgement of their last exchange, no overt sign that the rules had changed. He simply waited. Cecily, with a deliberate slowness, selected the yellow gardenia. As she wrapped it, she spoke, her voice calm, conversational. "There was a curious incident at the garrison yesterday, General. A shipment of uniforms, misdirected, I hear. A small matter, perhaps, but one that might cause inconvenience." She watched him, her gaze unwavering. The general had a reputation for absolute control over his garrison. Such a misstep, however minor, would be noted. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes for a fraction of a second narrowed. "Indeed," he murmured, his voice as precise as ever, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in timbre. "Misdirection implies intent, Miss Moore, or incompetence. Neither is tolerated." He did not confirm, did not deny. He simply stated a fact, a principle. Cecily handed him the gardenia. "So I would imagine," she replied, a faint, almost imperceptible curve to her lips. She had given him a piece of information, a small, inconsequential detail, but it was a detail that only the general would be concerned with. And he had responded, not as the quiet customer, but as the commander. He took the flower, his gloved hand brushing hers. This time there was no jolt, only a cool, professional contact. "A matter for the quartermaster, I believe," he concluded, his gaze sweeping over her face, searching, assessing. He knew she was testing him, and he was allowing it. He paid, and as he turned to leave, he paused, his back to her. The Charleston Mercury, Miss Moore, often distorts such matters for its own amusement. One must learn to read between the lines. He exited, the bell chiming, leaving Cecily with a new piece of the puzzle. He was not only confirming his identity, but offering a veiled warning, a strategic hint about the press. It was a general's move, precise and indirect. The following week, Cecily encountered him again at a small reception at the federal courthouse. General Vale, in full uniform, stood by the imposing fireplace, surrounded by a knot of officials. Senator Thorne was there again, his loud laugh echoing, clearly dominating the conversation. Cecily, ostensibly there to deliver a flower arrangement, found herself near enough to overhear. "The matter of the Broad Street foreclosures, General," Thorne boomed, "is moving along quite nicely. A few more stubborn holdouts, but nothing a little legal persuasion can't resolve. We'll have that land cleared for the new rail depot in no time." General Vale listened, his face a mask of polite but unyielding neutrality. His eyes, however, were fixed on Thorne, a cold, unwavering intensity in their depths. Cecily, discreetly placing a vase of white lilies, caught his eye. For a moment, their gazes met across the crowded room. This time there was no softening, no hint of the man from the greatcoat. He was all general, distant, formidable, his expression a carefully constructed barrier. Later that week, back in the shop, Cecily prepared for his Monday visit. She had learned something new about him. His quiet disdain for the predatory northern interests, like Thorne, who sought to profit from Charleston's ruin. It was a surprising detail, given his position. When he arrived, the familiar greatcoat a dark silhouette in the doorway, Cecily presented the gardenia. "The Broad Street foreclosures," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper. "They seem to be causing considerable distress among the old families. Many of them have nowhere else to go." He took the flower, his gaze steady. "Distress, Miss Moore, is a common consequence of debt and of war." His words were cold, pragmatic, but Cecily detected a subtle tension in his jaw, a flicker of something unsaid in his eyes. He was not indifferent, he was simply disciplined. "Perhaps," Cecily ventured, pushing further, "but some claim the terms of the loans were less than transparent, that the documents were altered after the fact or signed under duress." His gaze sharpened. He held the gardenia, turning it slowly in his gloved hand. "Accusations, Miss Moore, require evidence. Without it, they are merely complaints." His voice was low, almost a challenge. He was testing her now, probing her knowledge. Cecily met his gaze directly. "Evidence," she affirmed, her own voice steady. "Indeed, a precise and demanding thing." It was her own phrase thrown back at him, a subtle acknowledgement of their shared understanding. A faint, almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of his mouth. This time it was not an almost smile, but something more complex. A flicker of respect, perhaps, or a recognition of her own sharp mind. He held her gaze for a long moment, then with a curt nod paid and departed. And Cecily watched him go, a new understanding solidifying. He was not merely playing a game of dual identity for personal amusement. There was a purpose to it, a subtle investigation, perhaps, and he had recognized in her a similar precision, a similar capacity for observation. He was allowing her to see him in both his guises, because he saw something in her that he valued. It was a dangerous game, but one that, to her surprise, she found herself compelled to play. The yellow gardenia, clutched in his gloved hand, was no longer just a flower. It was a coded message, an invitation to a secret exchange. The exchanges continued, a delicate dance of veiled questions and precise indirect answers. Cecily, now fully aware of the general's dual persona, found herself increasingly fascinated by the man behind the uniform. In the shop, he remained the quiet observer, offering those rare clipped remarks that hinted at a deeper, more complex individual. At social functions, he was the unyielding general, a figure of authority and unapproachable discipline. Yet Cecily now saw the subtle tells, the way his gaze lingered for a fraction too long, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when Senator Thorne spoke of his financial conquests, the way his eyes, even in their coldest iteration, held that same profound depth. She continued her tests, weaving small, seemingly innocuous pieces of information into their Monday morning conversations. She spoke of local gossip, of the rising prices of cotton, of the lingering bitterness over the federal courts. And each time, the man in the greatcoat would respond, not with the warmth she might have once imagined, but with the pragmatic, analytical mind of the general. He would offer a strategic observation, a factual correction, or a quiet, almost philosophical comment that revealed the breadth of his understanding. He never raised his voice, never betrayed emotion, but his responses were always, unmistakably, the general's. One Monday, as the summer heat truly began to press down on Charleston, making the air thick and almost suffocating, he arrived in his greatcoat, a sweat-dampened line visible at his collar. Cecily, despite herself, felt a flicker of concern. "It is a formidable heat today, General," she observed, her voice low, "even for May." He took the yellow gardenia she offered, his gloved hand moving with its usual precision. "The climate here demands adaptability, Miss Moore," he stated, his gaze meeting hers. "One learns to conserve energy, to observe." "And what do you observe, General?" she dared to ask, pushing the boundaries of their silent agreement. His eyes, those deep grey-blue pools, held hers. "I observe that the resilience I spoke of previously is a constant, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in quiet persistence." He did not elaborate, he did not need to. He paid, and with a curt nod, departed. Cecily stood at the counter, the scent of the gardenias filling the air. Quiet persistence. Was he speaking of her, of the city, or of himself? She suspected it was all three. She began to notice other things. Small details, almost imperceptible. A new, more robust lock on the shop's back door, installed without explanation. A timely delivery of rare, expensive bulbs from a distant supplier just after she had mentioned their scarcity. These were not direct actions, not overt gifts. They were subtle adjustments to her world, improvements that appeared as if by chance, but which, on closer inspection, bore the hallmarks of a precise, unseen hand. One afternoon, Mrs. Bath, a kindly, sharp-eyed woman who ran the shop with a mix of tradition and pragmatism, mentioned something to Cecily. "You know, dear," she said, carefully snipping dead leaves from a potted fern, "that new delivery boy from the docks, young Thomas. He said the General himself had a word with his supervisor about expediting our shipments. Not a word to us, mind you, but Thomas heard it from the foreman. The General, asking about our flour orders. Imagine that." Cecily felt a sudden cold clarity. A knot tightened in her stomach. The new lock, the rare bulbs, the expedited shipments. It was him. He was acting on her behalf, subtly, silently, without a word. He was doing things for her in secret, things she had needed, things she hadn't even known she needed until they appeared. "The General," Cecily repeated, feigning surprise. "Why would he concern himself with our deliveries, Mrs. Bath?" Mrs. Bath chuckled, shaking her head. "No idea, dear. Perhaps he has a fondness for fresh flowers, or perhaps," she added, her eyes twinkling, "he simply sees a well-run establishment and appreciates efficiency. He's a man who notices things, they say, sees everything." Cecily offered a non-committal smile, but her mind was racing. He noticed small things obsessively. It was a professional habit, from commanding men in the field. He was applying that same tactical precision to her. He was not merely observing, he was acting, not from sentiment, but from a deeper, unarticulated concern. It was a quiet, complete, and utterly unexpected form of protection. Her initial resentment, the prickle of anger at his deception, began to soften, replaced by a complex mix of bewilderment and a nascent, unsettling warmth. He was not just playing a game, he was weaving a protective net around her, a subtle shield against the harsh realities of their city. She considered confronting him, demanding an explanation, but her pragmatism, honed by years of survival, held her back. He never explained his feelings. He showed them through small, precise actions. To confront him would be to demand a vulnerability he was clearly unwilling to offer, at least not yet, and it would break the delicate, unspoken understanding that now existed between them. The next Monday, when he arrived, the sun was bright, the heat already a palpable weight. He took the yellow gardenia, his gaze steady. "The railroad expansion," Cecily began, her voice low. It seems to be driving many small businesses to ruin, especially those on Broad Street. Senator Thorne's interests appear to be particularly aggressive. A subtle tension in his jaw. Aggression, Miss Moore, is often mistaken for strategy, but true strategy is built on solid ground, not on shifting sands. He held her gaze, a silent challenge in his eyes. One must have all the facts, all the evidence. Cecily nodded, her own gaze unwavering. She understood. He was not just speaking in generalities. He was inviting her to see the unseen thread, to understand the deeper game being played. He was not asking her to save herself. He was offering her the tools, the understanding to fight. And in that quiet, precise offer, she felt a profound, unspoken connection. The yellow gardenia felt like a promise. The unseen thread of the General's actions began to weave itself into the fabric of Cecily's daily life. Subtle yet undeniable. The enhanced security, the reliable deliveries, the subtle shifts in the flow of information she received, all pointed to his quiet hand. Her initial bewilderment had transformed into a profound, if unspoken, understanding. He was not merely a customer, he was a silent guardian, a strategist who saw her world with the same tactical precision he applied to his campaigns. Yet his dual identity remained. In the shop he was the man of the greatcoat, offering glimpses of a more contemplative self. At formal events he was the unyielding general, a figure of formidable authority. Cecily maintained her own careful facade, her professional demeanor unwavering. But the knowledge of his secret and his tacit awareness of her knowledge created a charged, silent dialogue between them. She found herself, despite her disciplined nature, waiting for Mondays with a strange blend of anticipation and trepidation. Each visit was a step deeper into the intricate game they played, a subtle exchange of information and unspoken understanding. The yellow gardenia, once a simple transaction, had become a symbol of this clandestine connection. One sweltering Tuesday afternoon, as the heat shimmered off the cobblestones, Cecily was overseeing the delivery of a large shipment of cut flowers. The young delivery boy, Thomas, a chatty lad with an eagerness to please, was carefully unloading buckets of hydrangeas. "My aunt works at the General's residence," Thomas offered, wiping sweat from his brow. "She says he's a man of strict routine. Every morning, precisely at 6, he's up. And every Monday morning, she says, he's out of the house by 8. Alone, mind you, no escort, no aides, just him and his thoughts." Cecily paused, a bucket of white roses held carefully in her hands. The words landed with the weight of confirmation. "Out by 8, you say? On Mondays?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the sudden clarity that enveloped her. "Aye, Miss Moore," Thomas confirmed, oblivious to the impact of his words. "My aunt says it's the only time he truly leaves the house without a full retinue. She says he goes to clear his head. But he's always back by 9, sharp, for his morning briefings." The pieces clicked into place with a definitive, almost audible snap. The Monday morning visits to Bath's florist. The timing, precise and unvarying. The absence of his military escort. The quiet, almost solitary nature of his visits. He came to her shop, not as General Vale, but as Dorian, the man who sought a moment of quiet, a single yellow gardenia, and a conversation that was not dictated by rank or protocol. The certainty when it arrived was absolute. There was no longer any room for doubt, no lingering questions about his dual identity. He was the general, and he was the man of the greatcoat. He sought her out, not for her social standing, of which she had little left, but for something else, something he could not find in the rigid structure of his military life. Cecily felt a strange mix of emotions, a profound sense of vulnerability, knowing he had revealed so much of himself to her, albeit indirectly. A flicker of something akin to admiration for his meticulous deception, for the sheer will it must have taken to maintain such a carefully constructed facade. And, unexpectedly, a deep, unsettling warmth that spread through her chest. He had chosen her. He had trusted her with this hidden facet of himself. That evening, as the gas lamps flickered to life along Meeting Street, casting long, dancing shadows, Cecily sat at her small desk in the back of the shop, poring over the ledgers. Her mind, however, kept returning to the general. She thought of his words, his observations, his subtle actions. He had never asked her to save him, never performed weakness. He had simply presented himself in his two guises and allowed her to observe, to deduce, to understand. She recalled his earlier statement, "You are the only thing in this world for which it was still worth returning from the war." The words, once a baffling remark from the man of the greatcoat, now resonated with a profound, almost devastating clarity. He had written them. He had intended to give them to her, and he hadn't. She remembered the 24th gardenia. It had been a particularly vibrant bloom, its petals a rich, buttery yellow. He had taken it, as always, and paid. But as she had cleared the counter, she had found it, tucked beneath the small brass cash register, a small folded piece of paper, thick and cream-colored, precisely folded. She had picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. It was not a receipt, not an order. It was a note, and in a bold military hand, precisely rendered, were the words, "You are the only thing in this world for which it was still worth returning from the war." Cecily had stared at the note, her breath catching in her throat. He had written it for her. He had intended to give it to her, but then at the last moment he had not. Why? Had he lost his nerve? Or was it another test, another layer of his carefully constructed reserve? She had kept the note, folded it carefully, and placed it within the pages of her most private ledger, a document of her own hidden truths. It was a secret she held close, a silent counterpoint to his own. Now, with Thomas's words confirming the Monday morning ritual, the note took on a new, urgent significance. He had chosen to be vulnerable, to express something profound, but then had retreated, allowing his actions to speak where his words could not. The game had shifted. She was no longer merely observing. She possessed a piece of his hidden heart, a truth he had almost revealed. The time for observation was over. The time for confrontation, for a truth spoken out loud, was rapidly approaching. She would not allow him to retreat into his carefully constructed silence. Not anymore. The silence in Bath's florist on Monday morning was different. It was not the usual tranquil quiet, but a charged, almost anticipatory stillness. The air, usually thick with the scent of flowers, felt taut, vibrating with unspoken words. Cecily, dressed in her dark blue working gown, moved with a deliberate slowness, arranging a cluster of white gardenias near the counter. Today the yellow ones waited, pristine and perfect, but her attention was elsewhere. She held the small folded note, its cream-colored paper softened by time, in her pocket. She knew he would come. He always did. And today, the carefully constructed edifice of their unspoken game would finally be tested. Precisely at 8:10, the familiar chime of the bell announced his arrival. He entered, his dark greatcoat a familiar silhouette against the bright morning. His movements were as precise as ever, his gaze sweeping the shop with that familiar, almost analytical intensity, before settling on Cecily. There was no outward change in his demeanor, no hint that this Monday was different from any other. He simply moved to the counter, his presence filling the space with its quiet, formidable weight. Cecily met his gaze. Her heart, usually so disciplined, gave a small, unbidden lurch. His eyes, those deep grey-blue eyes, held their usual stillness, their usual depth. But today, she looked past the general, past the man of the greatcoat, and saw for the first time Dorian, the man who had written those words, the man who had sought her out week after week for a single yellow gardenia and a moment of quiet, unburdened authenticity. She did not reach for the gardenia immediately. Instead, she simply stood, her hands resting on the cool wood of the counter, her gaze unwavering. "General Vale," she said, her voice low, steady, devoid of the usual professional distance. The full name, spoken in the quiet intimacy of the shop, hung in the air, a stark breaking of their unspoken rules. A flicker, a subtle tightening around his eyes, was his only reaction. He did not speak, did not move. He simply held her gaze, waiting. It was a silence that demanded truth. Cecily reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the folded note. She withdrew it, slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the counter between them. The cream-colored paper stood out against the dark wood. His gaze dropped to the note, then lifted to hers. A profound stillness settled over him, deeper than any she had witnessed before. His eyes, for the first time, betrayed something akin to surprise, a fleeting vulnerability. "You left this," Cecily stated, her voice soft but firm. "6 months ago, with the 24th Gardenia." He looked at the note, then at her, his expression a complex mixture of recognition and something she couldn't quite decipher. He did not deny it. He did not explain. He simply stood, a man caught in a moment he had meticulously avoided. "Thomas, the delivery boy," Cecily continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "told me your aunt says you leave the residence every Monday morning alone at 8 to clear your head." His gaze hardened slightly, a subtle shift that indicated a retreat to his military persona. The unspoken trust, the careful anonymity he had cultivated, had been breached. He was exposed. "Miss Moore," he began, his voice low, precise, "my movements are my own concern, and the contents of my personal notes." Cecily interrupted him, a rare act for her. "No, General," she said, her voice unwavering. "They are not. Not when you leave them in my shop. Not when they speak of returning from the war. And not when you cultivate 2 different men, one for the world and one for a flower shop." His eyes narrowed. The stillness returned, but this time it was charged with a different kind of intensity. He was not accustomed to being challenged, least of all by a woman in a flower shop. "I am the same man, Miss Moore," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a tactical retreat to fact. "My duties require a certain demeanor in society. My preferences are my own." "And your preferences," Cecily countered, her gaze holding his, "include a yellow gardenia every Monday, and words you were too afraid to deliver. Words that speak of a man, not a general." She pushed the note slightly closer to him. "You are the only thing in this world for which it was still worth returning from the war." She recited the line precisely, accurately. "Tell me what that means, General, or tell me why you never gave it to me." The room went silent. The only sounds were the distant clip-clop of a horse-drawn carriage on the cobblestones and the faint rustle of leaves outside. General Dorian Vale, the implacable commander, the man who never explained his feelings, stood exposed. He looked at the note, then at Cecily, his eyes searching hers. Finally he spoke, his voice so low it was almost a whisper, a stark contrast to his usual measured tone. "The war," he began, his gaze fixed on the note, "leaves an emptiness, a desolation. One learns to build walls, to trust only in strategy, in control." He paused, then looked up, his grey-blue eyes meeting hers, a raw, unvarnished truth in their depths. "In the shop I was not the general. I was simply Dorian. And you, Miss Moore, you saw that man. You did not defer. You did not flatter. You simply were. And in that, there was a quiet, unexpected peace." He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over the note, then withdrawing. "I did not deliver it because it was a vulnerability, a truth I was not prepared to share, not then." His gaze now was fixed on her, no longer tactical, but profoundly personal. "You, with your precision, your quiet strength, you were the only place I found a moment of true quiet after the war, a place where the walls could relax." Cecily felt a wave of understanding wash over her. It was not a grand declaration, not a sweeping romantic gesture. It was a precise, accurate statement of fact, delivered by a man who had been functionally alone for years. He had shown her his crack in the armor, not with words, but with a note he couldn't deliver, and a ritual he couldn't break. "And now?" Cecily asked, her voice soft but unwavering. "Now that the truth is spoken?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable yet filled with a profound intensity. "Now," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual precision, "the strategy must adapt, but the objective remains." He paused, then with a subtle shift, his gaze moved to the yellow gardenias. "May I have my flower, Miss Moore?" Cecily reached for the gardenia, her hands no longer trembling. As she wrapped it, she looked at him. "Dorian," she said, using his first name for the first time, a quiet, deliberate choice. "The walls you built, they are formidable. But even the strongest walls have a gate. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corners of his mouth. It was not an almost smile. It was a true smile, fleeting but genuine. He took the flower, his gloved hand brushing hers, a connection that now felt profoundly different. Perhaps, he murmured, his gaze holding hers, and perhaps some gates are meant to be opened. He paid, the coins clinking softly on the counter. "I will return next Monday, Cecily." He used her first name, not Miss Moore, Cecily Moore. He turned, the greatcoat a familiar silhouette, but his departure felt different. The bell chimed, but this time it was not the sound of an exit, but of a beginning. Cecily watched him go, the scent of gardenias filling the air, no longer a question, but a quiet, fragile promise. The truth had been spoken, not with grand gestures, but with precise, earned words. And in that quiet, empty room, a single true thing had been said out loud.
Monday morning, before the city wakes, I walk through silent streets with more than I can take. A war still lives inside me in ways you cannot see. A man the world remembers is not the man I need to be. You never asked my title, you never bowed your head. You spoke to me in silence and heard what I never said. Among the scent of gardenias and hands that never shake, you gave me something fragile, a quiet I could not fake. I built my walls in iron, I buried who I was, but somehow in your presence I forgot what war does. You were the only place I was not a general, the only truth I faced. It felt undeniable. No medals, no commands, no shadows left to hide. Just one yellow gardenia, and you standing by my side. I wrote the words I feared, folded them away. A truth too sharp to carry, a risk I couldn't say. But you found the silence between the lines I drew, and saw the man returning before I ever knew. If I had given you that letter, would it have changed the war in me? Or would I still be hiding from everything I couldn't be? You are the only place I laid my armor down, the only voice that reached me without a single sound. No orders left to give, no battles left to fight. Just one quiet truth. You brought me back to life. Every Monday morning I return to where you are, not as who they made me, but as who you saw.